Our final panel today is moderated by Dr. Jennifer Roberts, Assistant Director for Health Technology at the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy. This panel is titled AI in Healthcare, Risks of Race Detection in Medical Imaging. Please welcome Dr. Roberts to the stage.
Hello, everyone. So we'd like to get started. Great, so I'd like to start with some introductions. So first I'd like to introduce Dr. Leo Celi. Dr. Celi is the principal research scientist at MIT. He is also a physician in the Division of Pulmonary and Critical Care and Medicine at Beth Israel Deaconess Medical Center, and an associate professor part-time of medicine at Harvard. He's practiced medicine in 3 continents and has perspectives on healthcare delivery based on those experiences. In addition, in his role as a principal research scientist, he brings together both clinicians and data scientists to research new technologies that use data that's routinely connected in the intensive care unit. Next, I'd like to introduce Dr. Taha Kass-Hout. He is the Director of Machine Learning and Chief Medical Officer at Amazon Web Services. He leads health AI strategy, including Amazon's Comprehend Medical and Amazon Health Link. And as a physician executive and biostatistician, he served as the first Chief Information Officer of the FDA, where he established global data sharing platforms and pioneered use of emerging technologies. And then finally, I'm pleased to introduce Dr. Lala Seyyed-Kalantari, an associate research scientist at the Lowlandfield Tenenbaum Research Institute at Sinai Health in Toronto. Her research focuses on developing artificial intelligence-based medical image diagnostic methods, and she's earned awards for her work, including an NSERC postdoctoral fellowship, a Research in Motion Ontario Graduate Scholarship, and we're happy to have her here today because both she and Dr. Celi are co-authors on an interesting paper entitled Reading Race, AI Recognizes Patients' Racial Identity in Medical Images. So, I'd like to start out a little bit by digging into this paper in a little bit more detail. So to provide some background context, they've had a surprising finding about AI and race, where effectively we can detect correlates of race from images in a way that is invisible to the human eye and is quite robust. And we're interested today in discussing some of the implications that that has for health policy, healthcare access, and equity. So to start out, Lala, if you wouldn't mind talking a little bit about the motivation for the paper and some of the findings.
Hi, thank you for the invitation. Actually, maybe the story of that paper started like a while earlier when we were kind of analyzing the fairness of AI medical image diagnostic tools. And we find that those AI diagnostic tools, if we train them in very large annotated data set, and we reach a very high performance average across all patients, which was the standard approach that people were doing, and they were reaching very high performance, and they said, okay, we have a good model, it's a good time, maybe we can even compare them with radiologists and say, okay, we are good to go, and maybe it's good to deploy that model in practice. So we did kind of this similar approach. We trained AI model on those large data sets, but we wanted to make sure that all those data sets have equality of opportunity in correct disease diagnosis for all patients, regardless of their age, sex, race, or even their social economic status. So we were lucky that at that point we had Mimic CXR data set, and Mimic CXR data set provide those information for us about the patients. So we check, do one more, we add one more step in analyzing our AI model, which was fairness check. And we checked how is the correct disease diagnosis among different subpopulations that we had in our data set. And surprisingly, we find that historically underserved subpopulations, such as female patient, Black or Hispanic patient, young patient, or patients who are using Medicaid insurance who are often low income, we have lower correct diagnosis rate for them compared to the other subpopulation. So we published our results at that point, and then I was contacted with a group of scientists from different universities, including Dr. Celi from MIT, from Emory University, and a couple of other universities. And the purpose of that, we started a collaboration to kind of remove these biases and make AI model in medical image domain fair. So the first question that we had was that why this is happening. So we kind of do this analysis again in some other data set. For example, in a data set from Emory University where it has like 50-50% distribution of Black and white patients. And we see exactly consistent results. Still, the model was unfair to Black patients. So we were wondering why this is happening. And I remember we had a conversation in our team. And the good things about our team was that it was a multidisciplinary team. We had radiologists in the group and people from background in computer science. And the radiologist, the clinician in our team, they said, we haven't seen the patient when we are analyzing their images. We don't know their race. So how can we be unfair to a patient that, like, even we haven't seen that and we don't know their race? So we couldn't get it. Like, how could we be unfair? So that was an interesting question. And we said, OK, let's see if AI model can see the race of the patient from medical images. So we train the AI model to the race of the patient, and we just give the model the chest X-ray images. And we find that with a very high performance, we were able to detect the race of the patient by just looking at medical images, at X-rays. Then we said, OK, let's see if that's consistent across other data sets, different medical image modalities, different distribution of Black and white patients. So we have done a very thorough analysis in different data sets, where in some of the data sets, even like Black patients were dominant group, in some other they were minorities. So, and like very consistently, we reached the same results. And it was, they were able to detect the race. So the next question was that, OK, why this is happening? We came to solve a problem, and now we are seeing another problem. So how can AI model detect the race by looking at medical images? So there were a lot of discussions, and we were trying to figure out, OK, maybe it's the disease labels, maybe some diseases are more common in Black patients, some are less common, so maybe the algorithms using those information. Maybe it's the shape of the body, maybe it's the BMI of the patient, maybe it's the tissue, maybe it's the bone density. So a number of ideas, every meeting, bi-weekly meeting that we had, we just try to come up with an idea, and we were checking, and we find that no, none of them are the confounder here. And AI do not use those confounder to find, to do the race detection. So next, we were just kind of saying, OK, let's see, maybe the AI is looking some specific area in the image. Maybe there are some patches, some area in the image that they are more contributing in race detection. And when we done our study, there was not a solution. So it was not the things that AI model was using. It was such that all over the image kind of contributing in this race detection pattern. Then we said, okay, maybe let's try to kind of break it. Like we were so kind of, we wanted to do something that, okay, to find a point that AI couldn't do that anymore. So we tried to resize the images to very, very smaller size, even 4 by 4. And when you were looking at the images, it was like nothing. It was just a gray pixel. And in very small resolution, where it was not even visible that it's a chest X-ray image, still our model was able to do the race detection. And then I said, okay, let's pass it through maybe high-pass filter, low-pass filter, like try to add noise, make the image blurry. So we come to some scenario that like the image after, for example, passing through high-pass filter was just like a gray image. Like if I and a radiologist, like everybody, if was looking at that image, it was not even visible that there is an X-ray over there. And still, the model was able to detect the race even from that image. So it seems that like the race information was like a fingerprint across all the image and in different frequency regions. And like, long story short, we couldn't find out how AI can detect the race from medical images, but that was a very surprising thing because the fact is that AI model not only detect the race from the medical images, but in other studies, we have shown that AI model behave against historically underserved races, for example, behave against Black or Hispanic patient. Or for example, in another study that we have recently published in Nature Medicine, we have shown that AI model underdiagnosed, for example, Black patient at a higher rate compared to the other patient. And it would be very harmful for those patients because it means that they cannot receive the treatment in a timely manner. They might be underdiagnosed compared to the other races. So when we are combining, like when we are seeing the full picture, that AI can see the race and also behave against some races, it sounds very dangerous, especially if we want to move these models from paper to practice and deploy them.
Great, thank you, thank you. And I think having looked at some of the work, I think the most surprising thing to me was that, especially when you were doing some of the high-pass filters, so just the very high-frequency information, those images just look like a gray box, right? And it was still identifying race with a very high accuracy. So I guess, Leo, over to you next. I'd like to dig in a little bit more about how this presents challenges from a policy perspective and from a technology perspective, because ideally what we would like is to be able to say like, okay, well, we want to make medical decisions in a way that doesn't take into account race. We want to be able to put up a screen so that the AI can't see it, and it sounds like that may not be possible. So what are the challenges that we're seeing?
Yes, I'm going to expand concretely on why this is very disturbing to us. Because most of the time we say that we excluded the race, we excluded the sex. So there's no way our algorithms can be sexist or racist. But it turns out that computers are smarter than data scientists and clinicians because they figure out a way whether this patient is LGBTQ, they figure out a way if this patient is an IV drug user, even without that information available in the data set. So this is concerning because the data set that we're using to build these algorithms are real-world data. And we know that real-world data is rife with provider subjectivity, is rife with societal biases. And if we're not careful, those biases are going to be baked into your algorithms. So this consequence of health interventions that affect disparities, it's not really unique to AI. Historically, the design and evaluation of every medical product, whether that's a drug, a procedure, or a medical device, has been limited to certain populations. Biomedical research that informs tests and treatment recommendations are performed in a few rich countries and primarily in white individuals. And yet, these research would inform treatment guidelines around the world and across populations in the United States. We are very much aware that the accuracy as well as the harm of different medical interventions would vary across populations. During the past pandemic, everyone heard about the pulse oximeter and other infrared sensing technologies being less accurate among individuals of color. And this is, of course, a result of the way we design and evaluate medical products. From that end, we have two very specific recommendations from a policy perspective. The first is that perhaps we should be mandating labels to be put on every medical product, whether that's a drug, AI, or a medical device, that will explicitly state what is the composition of the individuals that these products were designed on or were evaluated on. If we had known this, perhaps there will be less heart attacks from Vioxx that we discovered after the launch of the product. If the prescribers were alerted to the fact that there were very few elderly patients who participated in the phase 3 trial, maybe we would have been more careful in prescribing these medications to patients who are outside the mix of the people who participated in the phase 3 trial. The other concrete recommendation that we could make is perhaps we should be requiring healthcare systems to have this, what we call disparity dashboards. So disparity dashboards would be a way to real-time track the differential accuracy, the differential effect of different medical products across demographics. And perhaps we will be able to detect if some of the medical device would be performing better in some demographics that's not explained by biological or disease factors. And perhaps we could tie in this dashboard disparities with, for example, accreditation of health systems by JCAHO, or perhaps even ACGME funding that's linked with funding organizations or training programs. But of course, the ultimate solution to this problem is to overhaul the way we innovate, overhaul the way we design and evaluate medical products. And I think the first step to be able to do that is to really broaden the diversity of the research community, broaden the diversity of the community that innovates for healthcare.
Great points. Great, and now, Taha, it would be helpful if you would talk a little bit about an industry perspective.
Yeah, absolutely. No, thank you so much for having me today. I mean, first, perhaps if I can set the stage around, like if you look globally today, health business is a massive business, about $7.5 trillion worldwide. Yet 40% of the world population doesn't have access to care, not high quality care, any care at all. So innovations such in technologies and artificial intelligence and applications and machine learning have to be part of that future to provide more equitable access to care. We see innovations such as precision medicine, innovations technologies like chatbots and APIs for data interoperability and conversational bots. Those may provide the answer to really help sort of close gaps in cares and provide better access and provide more equitable access. If you look today where the state of machine learning and this field is, I mean, dust has settled on a few really key areas where there's, this is a truly transformational technology from augmenting human expertise to designing better trials, to operate more efficiently, to making sense of large amount of information. I mean, the medical data is highly contextual and it's a grant. I mean, we're talking about health systems today generate about close to 5,000 petabytes of data every day. The majority of that, almost 97% of that, is not accessible for analysis or for queries. So machine learning depth in areas such as pattern recognition, such as natural language processing, or predictions are really helpful sort of technologies in this space. But while AI is transformational in this sense, it's also important that we use this technology responsibly and be able to instill the right mechanisms within that to identify biases, to be able, and not just in the models and how they're behaving, but look at this entirely as an end-to-end data strategy where at every step in the way, bias can happen. I mean, can happen from your data preparation, can happen from, for example, where it's baked in medical practice, so it's an unconscious, can happen because of technical issues, all the way when you train those models, really understand what went in those models in the first place, what influence each of those decisions, because as we're learning here, it's, those features not only can be predictors, but can also contaminate the data. And then once you put out the machine learning models to deploy them, is how can you monitor those, that they're doing what's intended to do, and then be able to adjust those models appropriately, and always have a human in the loop to review those models. So we at Amazon Web Services been working closely with customers and regulators and the wide industry we're making material investment in building the right tools and giving the right guidance about how you can detect bias early. How can you design these models the right way? How can we really help you to start breaking the black box and identifying what went in those models, how you can monitor that in the wild. And it's an iterative process where we believe that the more responsible this application of machine learning through AI and other technologies, not only will be transformational to many industries, including healthcare, but also has to be done in a responsible way.
Great, thank you. So I guess digging in a little bit more to this idea of perhaps having safety labels, being able to advertise which populations the technology has been tested in, and how to do continuous monitoring so that, phase 3 clinical trial, that is going to be by its nature a smaller group. How can we continue grabbing information as new technologies, treatments, AI are deployed? What do we need to think about in order to execute on that vision, both from perhaps a technical sense, being able to pull in that information, and also a policy sense, where we might think about which government organizations, how do we align payment, how do we align safety testing, how do we align other types of enforcement actions, et cetera, in order to make it so that we really can move from this being an idea that we are tracking the safety over time to actually having the incentives in place to make it a reality.
I can start. One thing that has really gained traction over the past few years is the open data science movement. So I think the idea of being able to monitor all these massive troves of data is going to be impossible for one organization. The FDA won't be able to do it, the CDC won't be able to do it, and we really need to leverage the expertise and the perspectives of a large group of people. So there has to be more incentives to data sharing. And of course, we're gonna have to address the concerns around privacy. The NIH is definitely having a lot of steps to promote that. They have announced this new policy that anyone who's applying for funding has to commit that they will be sharing the data to the rest of the research community. And what that does is there is transparency, there is openness on what you are doing with the data, what analysis are you performing, and we need that so that society will trust us. So what are the policies that will further promote open data science movement? How can we leverage the talent that you find at universities? Universities are full of students who are excited with the prospect of being able to contribute back to society, and yet we give them synthetic homeworks that's been put together 10 years ago, when in fact they get more enthused by real-world problems. Perhaps we give them access to some of these data sets, and they could help with the monitoring of the impact on disparities of different medical products. So these are a lot of ideas. It's really very nebulous at this point, and we need to find ways of operationalizing those ideas.
Great.
So I can maybe add to that even like in addition to like sharing the data and also being more active in like collaborative working on, for example, having a pipeline to such that, for example, people trust more to share their data for the research. In addition to that, I may say that maybe we need to think of like some other aspect that, for example, what are the attributes that we need to gather? For example, not the image itself or not the disease label itself. It may be helpful for disease diagnosis algorithm, training those AI model for disease diagnosis, but if we want to attack things such as fairness, we need to think of like, what are the factors that we need to know about the patient? So race could be one of them, like age of the patient could be one of them, but there might be a lot of other factors that we even may not know them, and we may need to think of and coming to some kind of policies that what are the attributes that we really need to have about the patient to do our analysis. For example, about the first detection, like about the papers that we have in the area of fairness, if we didn't have the race information gathered at Mimic CXR dataset, we were not able to do that analysis, and we were not able to know that and bring the awareness to the society that these biases are existing. So I think this is also an important things that like people sharing their data and also think of what are the factors are needed to be gathered when we are building AI model.
Yeah, I mean, again, I talked about like how the massive amount of information collected every day by health systems. I mean, if we break that down a little bit, health data is highly unstructured and multimodal in nature. The majority of data is medical notes, like doctor notes, triage notes. You have traces of EKG or EEG, chest X-rays, MRIs, pixels. You have now new modality of information, like seen throughout COVID with telemedicine, and now you have video conversations, chatbots, and voice. So it's a sheer volume and complexity for a lot of our customers that we deal with, how you go about structuring this information in order for you to build something more responsible. So when you start breaking this throughout the entire end-to-end data journey, for example, in the financial industry, I mean, it was very important that they can explain the financial model and the risk management and how they came up about the decision by explaining what went in the model in the first place. And that was a great inspiration for us to start Amazon Clarify. It's part of our machine learning end-to-end product called SageMaker, where it can help you build, train, and deploy and monitor models. But Clarify was important in a sense where it can go really deep into understanding every feature that went into the model, which ones are predictable of your outcome, which ones are you might really look and consider, and which ones are causing the most bias in the model. But it doesn't stop there, because that's starts really early at the data preparation phase. And now as you start building those models and train a new model, then with SageMaker you'll be able to also understand how those models are behaving, to understand biases in the data, or biases might be in the prediction given, for example, demographic variations and whatnot. And then as you deploy these models in the wild, on edge devices or what have you, is be able now to monitor how these systems are behaving. I mean, the typical example today, you can build a model on one hospital system for radiology or other things, just walk with the same model across the street to another hospital, and suddenly the model doesn't perform. Well, how can you take a prediction, for example, heart failure, in one community and go and validate in another community and have the understanding that it will behave, but if it doesn't really understand deep into the features that went in those models in the first place. And lastly is about how we can monitor those models. So as you deploy those models, you'll be able to kind of monitor the performance of those. And everyone here in the room knows that you never just build one machine learning. I mean, you build hundreds of thousands, sometimes tens of thousands, depending on the outcome, to come up with the right ones that can help you achieve the outcome. But you don't. It's not one time and you're done. You constantly have to kind of keep monitoring how they're doing it. So we're making material investment and giving you the tools and the guidance about how you can do this end to end, from the data preparation. So when you build those models to when you deploy them, in order for you to have a full visibility, consider that like a leader dashboard of a sense about how your models are performing and where are the areas that you really need to intervene and be able to not just understand those models, but understand the behavior of those models in the wild.
Yeah, that's great. So I think, if we're looking at being able to use explainability as a tool to help with equity, right? That's very important. It's a core part of the Biden-Harris administration's goals there to have equity across government in healthcare. And I think what we would like is to be able to have explainability where, okay, it lets us know this algorithm's no longer working, we need to tweak, we need to improve. Okay, over here we have explainability that's showing that these are the features that are contributing to perhaps an inequitable result. Are we at the point with the explainability technology that we can confidently say that, or is there still more work to be done on explainability to be able to say when and why it is that we are seeing different outcomes for different groups?
So maybe I can say it's a kind of an active research still to finding that, like, why these things are happening and why we have these problems in AI models that we are building. I think one approach is maybe when we want to tackle a problem, we need to know the characteristics of that problems. So, for example, for biases, I see that like people maybe at some point, like a few years ago, maybe the goal was to make a model which has a high predictability. And we thought that, okay, if we have a good model which could have a high performance, then we are good to go. And now we are getting to the point that we are saying, okay, no, that's not good. It's not enough. And it's not provide fairness if we are having a high performance model. So some other things, for example, I see that, for example, when I talk to people who are gathering data, some of them, they are coming and telling me, okay, oh, you are doing fairness, that's so exciting, but we don't have any fairness problem. We are sure about our data set. Why? Because we have equal proportion of male and female patient in our data set, so don't come across us, we are good. But what we find was that, no, like even like being, there is not a, for example, a statistically significant correlation between the unfairness that we are seeing and the proportion of the patient that, for example, we have. And just if you are equalizing your data set, if you are like making a good like equal distribution in your data set across different subpopulation, it doesn't provide fairness. And also, it's not even possible if you consider that like it's not just about the sex of the patient, it's not just about the race of the patient, it could be a lot of factors. And if you down and like go to like different intersectional identity, you see it's not really easy to build a model which is like equally distributed along like all patients. And also, even if you do that, our studies have shown that it doesn't provide fairness. It doesn't put you in a secure position. So, for example, one other maybe common misunderstanding that we have about like fairness is that, okay, if you don't put, if you don't gather the race information, then you are fine. Like people are coming, they are filling forms, we are not asking them what's your race, and we are not putting that in our AI model training, and then we are fine. And then again, our studies shows that it's not that easy, that like if you just don't put the race information, still AI may get that information somehow. So I think I think for me, at least, as someone who is working in the area of fairness in medical imaging, at least, I think still we are learning what is the thing that we are facing and what are the characteristics of the biases that we are seeing. So if we want to kind of make the system fair, we need to know those characteristics and try to resolve them based on the characteristics that we are finding. And I think we are still in an active research in this area to find some solutions for these things. It could be like finding the confounder that's causing these problems, or even if we are not able to find that confounder, maybe we are trying to algorithmically resolve this problem, but it's still an active research and we need to work on that.
So, I mean, a couple of things here. I mean, like today, if you look at the most commonly used clinical models in the field, like predicting someone's stroke risk or heart risk, I mean, they're made from readily available variables or features based on clinical judgment and expertise. I mean, about 20, 30 variables at most. So you know exactly what went in the models, yet these models perform incredibly poorly in clinical care. Like anywhere, like leaving you a lot of false positive or false negative. So here's like a totally controlled sort of environment. As I mentioned before, I mean, patients have a lot of unstructured data around them. As a matter of fact, I mean, any of us have at least 300, 400,000 data points on us in just our medical record, that none of that is used at point of care. So this is where area machine learning can really help structure, index that information in ways that are scalable, so that we can build better models, you can design better trials, you can make better decisions. I'll give you another example. I mean, sepsis is which is infection in the hospital. It's also another studied sort of condition. A lot of clinical models in the field, for the major part, they do great. Where machine learning is really great is finding features that us clinicians are not trained to even include in that model, like someone's blood draw at 3 o'clock in the morning. This is a feature a machine learning can really help distill and extract that you haven't paid attention to that. And this is one of the greatest power about these machine learning techniques. As I mentioned, natural language processing is a wonderful tool if we know how to really use it. Because to get closer to explainability and fairness, you've got to index a lot more information to be able to really understand in the full context longitudinally what happened in someone's entire journey. I mean, we assume diabetes is one thing. Only 10% diabetic patients are similar. Hypertension, high blood pressure, just ask any patient with hypertension. Takes their physician 2 to 3 years just to get them on the right medication. Patients, even for most common conditions, are more unique than you think. And if we just limit ourselves to a smaller data set, that, not really kind of widen the horizon about how can we really index more information about these individuals in order to kind of get to that next level of fairness, equitable access, and be able to start really personalizing to these individuals. But do that in a responsible way that can and really understand that, as clearly mentioned here, some of these can be co-founders, and you really need to understand that not every feature is predictable. Some of these features can be contaminant. Right? And which brings me to the second problem in health is, unlike dogs and cats images on the net, healthcare is a labeling desert. I mean, we don't have enough data out there to train on to be able to benchmark against. And machine learning can definitely help there. I mean, also clinicians' time is very, very expensive to annotate medical images, but there are advances and innovations in machine learning, like zero-shot approaches and how we can train 1% of the data to get the same performance as if you annotate the entire data sets. These are innovations we should really look much closer to. And again, these are areas we're really excited about. We're making a lot of material investment in terms not just technologies and services, but also guidance and iterative process where we continue want to hear more about how we can better design these to do the right thing they're supposed to do.
That's great. So, please.
I was going to say that despite all the challenges that we are talking about, I say that we shouldn't stop doing what we're doing because I think that this is the right path. The status quo is so suboptimal. computers and AI are easier to audit compared to clinicians. It's harder to call out a colleague that, hey, that decision of yours is actually racist or sexist. It's much harder to do that. But computers, you could look at the data input, you could look at the data output, you could look at the relationship of the features. So definitely this is the way to go. But having said that, we really need to be careful. We shouldn't be rushing and pushing this to the front lines of care. I'm not a big fan of federated learning or synthetic data because it's hard enough to identify the biases when you can see all the data. Just imagine how difficult it's going to be if you could only see a part of the data. So federated learning is not the answer to address fairness. And I also wanted to point out that fairness is not a machine learning problem. We need to work with more social scientists. Where are the social scientists in our modeling? Where are the social determinants in the clinical models that we're deploying? We know that the vast contributor of health outcomes is actually not the clinical data, it's the social determinants, and yet there are very few models that would actually incorporate social determinants in the features that we include in the model. But we were talking earlier, and we were saying that it's funny listening to people, privileged people like us, defining fairness and talking about the metrics for fairness. I don't think that we have the authority to do that. We need to bring in more people who have the right perspectives, who have the right lived experiences. And I think that's the only way we could move forward. A bunch of academics, a bunch of industry giants discussing what fairness in algorithm is, I don't think is the right way to do this.
Yes, I think that's a great point. And just a note, we'd like to open it up to questions. So if folks have any questions, please come down to the microphone. So I guess while we're waiting for folks to get there, just to summarize then, it sounds like there are a lot of concrete things that we can do on the policy side, on the regulation side, to provide transparency into the algorithms, transparency about biases that might be on the data side, and we should start taking those actions today. And then there's still a lot of work to be done on the research side to improve our ability and expose these things that we don't yet understand, don't yet know. So we need to have a multi-pronged approach where we are making policy, transparency, et cetera, strides, while also pushing the envelope. And then really we need to be able to provide that transparency in a way that then allows folks who have the life experiences to make strong statements about this is fair, this is not, and provide that transparency that allows more voices in that conversation as we're figuring out where our long-term goal post might be. So I'd like to have a question over here.
Yeah, hi, I am from Salesforce AI, and my question is especially touch basing on the last answer that was mentioned in terms of we don't have the authority to define fairness, etc. Shouldn't we see quality in general, and fairness, bias, etc. are aspects of quality, right? Like, let's just talk about quality. Shouldn't we see it as a stakeholder problem where we have different stakeholders with different definitions of what is quality to them? To me, it's fair to earn $1 million a day. It's not fair to somebody else, right? But the point is, what is it from these two industries that we are sort of displaying now, health industry and the banking industry, that makes them such a good template for regulating the entire AI system, where we kind of know that the stakeholder power is very tilted towards, especially in the banking case, right? Like where, since the birth of banking, the Medici and the Venice state were one and the same thing. They cannot regulate themselves. So shouldn't we just think in terms of empowering the stakeholders that we're talking about? And stakeholders in the healthcare industry, there are many. The doctor, I don't know, ethic boards, et cetera, but also the consumer, the customer. So shouldn't we reframe a little bit this whole conversation? And what's the approach, what's the thinking specifically in healthcare?
I mean, health is, the principle is always do no harm. That's really what the premise there. And the way we look at it is a cyclical process. I mean, as you design these models to do what they're intended to do is look at that as an end-to-end problem and look at iterative input from policymakers, technologists, developers, consumers, and those going to be affected by these algorithms, and then keep kind of iterating on how we can improve the cycle, but also break it into its components. Whether it's understanding the biases that can be from when you collect the information, annotate the information, develop these models, deploy these models. I mean, it's the same thing in clinical trials. When you put a drug out there, like a blood pressure drug in 1992, was designed on 2,700 patients. Since then, 2.5 billion people have taken that same drug, and there's a ton more adverse events being, we learned over time. So it's not a one-shot thing. You really gotta keep on iterating that and take that feedback in the design about what you're doing.
Yeah, and if I also want to add a little bit to that, is that I think like based on like the application of the algorithms, we don't have a like one fairness definition that can be applied to anything. Like even if you are building like disease diagnosis on chest X-ray, like medical imaging algorithms, even for that algorithm, if it's going to be used beside a doctor in a clinic, you may be worried about to having a correct disease diagnosis. You may be concerned about disease label. But if you want to use same algorithm in triage, maybe you are more concerned about not to underdiagnose patient, but you are not really caring about like if it can correctly diagnose a disease or not. Because in that stage, we want to make sure that we are not labeling an unhealthy patient as healthy and cause delay in access to care for that patient. So, I mean, depends on where the algorithms is using, how we want to use it, who is the customer, and what's the environment. All of them are affecting on how we are defining our fairness metrics, and there should be like thorough analysis in different scenario, and we come to different definition based on each scenario.
Great. And then also healthcare access. Next question.
Hi, hello. Great talk by everybody and all the panelists. My name is Christian Perez. I'm a Tech Congress Fellow. I work in public policy. Given the recent benchmarks set by NIST on facial recognition standards and AI, I was wondering if you could come up with a list of possible benchmarks to establish for AI applications in medical devising images. I think that there's a sour need for this right now, given the lack of reference data that we have with these medical images. And I also know that one of the panelists mentioned having an open repository for AI researchers to use. So again, the question would be, if we were to set certain benchmarks to reduce racial bias in these AI applications in medical imaging, what would be those benchmarks? Thank you.
Yeah.
I mean, I'll talk about some of the initiatives of the NIH. So there's the Aim Ahead initiative, there's the Bridge to AI application, and they're really wanting to make sure that all the different populations are represented in this benchmark data sets. Why do we have benchmark data sets coming only from academic institutions that predominantly take care of white individuals? So somehow we need to address that. We haven't even talked about data poverty. Some people never even interface with the healthcare systems, and they're the ones who disproportionately carry the burden of disease. So we need to think about that. And one thing that I always advise our computer science students is that before you even perform any exploratory data analysis, you need to understand the landscape. You cannot just go in there and do your EDA and do your bar graphs without understanding who are the population that is marginalized in that particular domain. If you're working with the ICU data, are there populations who die at home who don't even reach the hospital? Because you're going to be introducing some sampling selection when you start building models, and they're not going to apply to the population in general. And the other point that I wanted to just reiterate that has been alluded to earlier is this idea of being able to sell algorithms. I think we really need to move away from patenting of algorithms and buying and selling of algorithms. I think that will kill a lot of patients because the accuracy, the performance of models can never be guaranteed. Even if you validated it in 5 hospitals, it doesn't mean that it's going to work on a 6th hospital. And as pointed out earlier too, the performance is going to change over time. So buying something and thinking that it's going to work well for the next 5 years is a delusion. So I think the business model should really be providing some expertise to healthcare organizations in creating and monitoring their own algorithms rather than building an algorithm, patenting it, and selling it to different healthcare systems.
Great. And I guess expanding on that point that just because it works in 5 hospitals, it doesn't mean it works in the 6. Even within the same hospital, if there is an upgrade to the EHR system or something like that, that can make it so that the algorithm no longer works as well. Taha, did you want to talk about something?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this is like a recent example. Like, you know, in the health system today, every health system acquiring the next hospital, except, you know, acquiring the next hospital, they're using an older code of ICD, you know, condition ontology, ICD-9, and now you're using ICD-10, and suddenly your model no longer works. You can look at that as more technical bias, but it's a true thing. Like suddenly your model no longer works. But I think, I mean, I think back to the question. I think NIST doing that is great, is really great for the whole society. I mean, we need more of these benchmark data sets. But more importantly, also, is a human in the loop, where a human expert like a clinician can really assess the intention of these models. I think American Medical Informatics Association, or AMIA, really had a really nice pragmatic sort of approach to explainability in a way that, similar to your labeling sort of the analogy is each one of these models, we really need to understand their limitations, the intended use, their operational parameters, what they're good for, what they're not good for, and that is going to help also still more innovation in the space while continue to provide the transparency needed.
Great. Another question?
Thanks so much for the great discussion. I just wanted to get your thoughts on the different notions of fairness here. So I think roughly we all can agree that if a model is more accurate for, let's say, race A or a gender than the other gender or another race, that's clearly a problem and that needs to be addressed. But I was just wondering, as we were talking so much about this confounders creating the effect of race or gender, right, for that matter, any sensitive attribute. While it is clearly bad to say, oh, I'm using your race to decide if you get a loan or if you get a job, it may not always be bad to use that information, especially when it comes to things like healthcare, disease diagnosis, or treatment recommendations, or just predicting risks of certain diseases. For example, I'm perfectly fine if there is a model that says, you're an Indian American, that's why I'm telling you, you are at a higher risk of getting this disease, right? And that's perfectly fine. I wonder if we are, you know, in an effort to sort of remove these race and gender out of the picture, I wonder if we are also doing it in certain applications or cases where it could legitimately help somebody. Thank you.
Oh, go ahead.
Go ahead, yeah.
Now, I was going to say that in a perfect world, what we want is a prediction if the world were fair and everyone gets access to quality healthcare. But to be able to build those models, you need the data sets. And that's the counterfactual data set, and that doesn't exist. It's like building a bank loan algorithm where in the data set, all the blacks and Hispanics living in a certain zip code are automatically denied bank loan, and they never even get into the algorithm. So how can you predict if they're going to be able to repay the loan if they never made it to the database in the first place? So this is a very complicated issue, and I wish that more of the machine learning community would actually focus their efforts on understanding this better rather than coming up with a new methodology that will up the performance by a few percentage points. I don't think that those projects are going to move the needle, and I think we need more expertise and talent to determine how to best move forward. And I think one concrete step is, again, involving more social scientists, involving more patient advocacy groups in the way we build these models.
Great. Well, thank you for the very robust discussion. It looks like we are out of time. Really appreciate everybody's insights today.